Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint an Order of the Wounded Heart, Sister of Battle. It's one from the Sisters of Battle starter box, and it's got the crispy burning heretic at her feet, so we'll be painting that up as well. Okay, so the first colour that we're going to use on this one is Citadel Khorne Flesh. I'm going to use this to paint the inside of the robes. So that's the inside of the robes at the back and on the inside of the loincloth at the front. Then you've also got the inside of the two sleeves. And if there's any parchments on the model, if you're following this with maybe one of the Bolter sisters or one of the other ones, you also want to paint any of the scrolls with the Khorne Flesh too. The next colour is Citadel Wazdakka Red. Now we sprayed up the model red initially. It doesn't really matter anymore because it's a slightly different colour red that I want to use for the armour. Now if you look at the different orders of Sisters of Battle, I went for the Order of the Wounded Heart because it's a slightly darker red than usual. And the main reason I wanted the red Sisters of Battle army is because I don't have another red army. So whereas you've got your Order of the Martyred Lady in black and I've got Black Legion, then you've got ones in silver and I've got Necrons, you've got ones in yellow, I've got the Lamenters, so I decided on a red army for the Sisters of Battle. I like this red because it's a bit darker than I usually paint red. So next up we're going to use black. This is going to be for the outside of the robes. We're also going to use it on the casing for the flamer, or if you're following this tutorial with one of the Boltgun, the casing of the Boltgun. I thought I'd paint this one with the flamer just because it gives the opportunity to do a few little different techniques of tempered metal on the barrel of the flamer. Then you've also got the crispy heretic at her feet. You also want to do a few little different techniques on that. Show you how you can paint up the flames and how you can make it look like it's a bit crispy and burnt. But to be honest, any of the Sisters of Battle models they've released is good for a tutorial. Now I'm going to do the little bit of skin that's on show using a bit of Citadel Cadian Flesh Tone. Now I'm trying to use more Citadel colours on the tutorials as I go along for Citadel miniatures because it tends to be what a lot of people have. So there will be more Citadel colours used. Still going to be a few Vallejo ones. I do prefer the Vallejo black, white and the Model Air chrome as well. That's still my favourite shiny silver. So onto Vallejo Model Air chrome. I'm just going to use this to paint all the tubing, a few little parts on the backpack, and a few little parts also on the flamer. We've also got the rosary beads, which a lot of the sisters have. You want to be painting each individual spot of those with this silver as well. It's a nice, bright, really pigmented silver. It's really smooth, so it's really easy to paint with. It does look really good. It coats pretty much anything. You can even paint over white with it. So next up, we're going to use Vallejo white. This is just to do the fleur-de-lis on one shoulder, the eagle on the other shoulder, and also her hair. I'm probably going to do one of the Penitence engines pretty soon as a tutorial, but I may do it as two-parter just because the actual size of it and the amount of different details and things like that within each one is pretty spectacular. Next up we're going on to Citadel Retributor armour. So yeah, with the Penitence engines they'll be doing one of the pilot where he's strapped in screaming a little bit with all the tubes and the syringes going into his back, the cables coming out of him. And then probably do another tutorial for the separate engine itself, because that'll probably actually be a lot easier than painting the pilot, because the pilot's got a lot of good details on there. A lot of them will be hidden when you put them together, which is a shame, but it's like the inside of a rhino. I've always got to paint it. Next we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Mournfang Brown. I'm going to use this just to do all the pouches. So most of them tend to have a holster and one or two little pouches on there, so you just want to paint them with a nice smooth coat of Mournfang Brown. So any particular sisters miniatures that anyone wants to see as well, just give me a shout. Post up on the channel there so we can see. We'll see which ones we've got that we can do. Here we're just going to add a few little colours to it to catch up. So we've got the Vallejo Model Air Chrome, which we've already used because we've just done the Retributor armour. I'm just adding the chrome onto these sections in the bands and the little skulls on the Promethean bottles there. I'm going to start a little bit of black onto the robes as well. I'm just going to add a little bit of black onto this little band on the leg here. It's just to catch up and tidy things up a bit so we've got the base colours everywhere that we want them. So next up we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Evil Sun Scarlet and also a little bit of Citadel Avalanche Sunset. This is just to put some base colours onto the crispy heretic. So generally giving it a coat of Evil Sun Scarlet to brighten up that red a little bit more. I thought that the Evil Sun Scarlet looks a little bit more like a bright red, inflamed kind of wound colour. So if you look at, or if you've seen any burns and things like that where they're pretty nasty, you will find that they have a lot of this really vivid red to them. So I'm doing that with spots of Avalanche Sunset, which you don't really see in that previous bit. So I'm going to be using a little bit of Vallejo White to paint the flames here. Now they are done as smoke, I think, on the Games Workshop miniature, but I really like the idea of having the flames still going on it. She's standing on the corpse. So you can see from the previous part where we've put little splodges of Citadel Avalanche Sunset on top of the Evil Sun Scarlet for a few areas, just to give that nasty yellowish colour that you see on really bad burns. Then we're just going to give a nice smooth layer of white all over the smoke or the flames here. So the first shade we're using is Citadel Druchii Violet. We're going to use that on all of the Battle Sisters armour. And try and keep that off the white sections like the hair and the eagle or the fleur-de-lis if you can. It's not really too much of a problem if you go over it. You can easily correct that later on. So next up is going to be Vallejo Wash Pale Grey. I'm just going to use this on the hair and on the shoulder pads for the fleur-de-lis and the Imperial Eagle. It's a very pale grey colour this, but I like it because it means that you can re-highlight the hair and stuff. And it gives it that really bright look, but it's still got that little hint of shade. So now we're using Citadel Seraphim Sepia on the Rakarth flesh area. So there's the inside of all the robes, and obviously if there's any parchments on the miniature that you're painting, any parts of the parchment too. Next, a little tiny bit of Reikland flesh shade just to use on the face. There's only a tiny little bit of face on display there, so if you put a bit too much flesh shade on there, or a bit too much shade, you can just use the tip of your brush to absorb that. Now we're going to move on to Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm going to use this to go over the whole of the corpse, even the areas that are in yellow, as well the Evil Suns gives it a nice bright raw kind of wound look. Carroburg Crimson gets into all the nooks and crannies, darkens them down so they look a bit deeper and gunkier, so to speak, but you've still got that nice bright red on show around the model itself. Like so. Next up we're going to use Citadel Agrax Earthshade. Going to use this to go over all of the gold. like so. Now it's Citadel Nuln Oil. We're going to use this on all of the silver coloured parts. The bits of the flame of the tubing, the rosary beads, those little skulls that are on the Promethean canisters. I'm going to start working on the flames, so we're going to start with Citadel Cassandora Yellow. Now when I'm first doing this, I'm leaving little bits of white at the bottom of the flames, but I actually come back at a later point and go over them, so if you're painting it up, just paint the whole of the flames with Cassandora Yellow and you can't go wrong. It'll save you coming back to finish them off later. Next we're going to be using Citadel Fugan Orange Shade. You're going to be doing kind of like the top ridges, maybe the top half of the flames. So where you've got the thicker areas, you're going to be adding this to it, leaving some of the Cassandora Yellow visible behind it. Now if you think of the way flames work, where the further it gets out from the central point of the fire, the darker it gets. That's what you're trying to go for here. So when I finish this, I've added a bit too much orange to it, but we can come back and I'll show you how to touch that up in the next couple of clips or so. So with the orange done, you can see there's maybe a little bit too much there. We're now going to work on Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm going to add this in much the same way. On certain parts of this you may see me adding an extra layer or going over bits that have already got Carroburg Crimson on. Once they're dry, you can go over it again to darken it up, as you would get a lot of darker areas on the flames from the red. And then the red would obviously go into black as it turns into smoke. So you can just keep adding layers of shade to the red to darken up the areas that you're going to have a bit of black on there, and that will help it to sort of merge in. So before we go back and touch up the flame, we're just going to work on the crispy heretic a little bit. So we're going to use Vallejo Burnt Umber. What we're going to do here is all these little raised areas of crispiness, whether it's burnt armour or skin or what have you, we're just going to paint all these up with burnt umber first. So you want to make sure that you leave the red between all the little sections. A little bit out of focus there. You're basically going to go over each one of these individually and paint them up so it's got each of them with a nice layer of burnt umber or a similar brown, dark brown. Next we're going to use Vallejo Black, and we're going to go over these sections that we've just done with burnt umber, but you're just going to paint them black and leave a little bit of burnt umber around the edges of it. Now this is very time consuming when you do this because there's loads of separate little sections. As you go along you'll probably find some that you've missed or some that were a little bit obscured, so when you come across them just paint them up the same as this. The idea is that these are the really crispy parts, the parts that have been properly scorched and burnt, while the sections which are red are still unburnt. They're probably just a bit more well cooked and looking a little bit more open and raw. Now we're going to return to painting the flames. I'm going to start with Citadel Fire Dragon Bright. Now this is a method of if you maybe put too much or too little of the Fugan Orange onto the flames and make a bit of a mess of it, this is an ideal way that you can touch it up. So here I'm just using a little touch of Fire Dragon Bright to smooth off some of those areas where I've put the Fugan Orange. Add it a bit more accurately to certain areas because you can't always do it with the shade with a bigger brush, because I do tend to use a bigger brush. And also you can use it to blend in the orange to the red a little bit as well, to kind of smooth that off. And now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Uriel Yellow. Now this is a nice bright yellow that you can use, and doing exactly the same as you did with the Fugan Orange, but working the opposite way. So you're using this to blend the yellow into the orange. just to touch up any of the little bits of yellow where you may have gone over with any of the other colours. Now I chose this over Overland Sunset because Overland Sunset isn't that bright a colour, and when you look at the likes of Flash Gitz yellow, that's a far too almost neon or luminous kind of yellow, whereas Uriel yellow is quite a bright yellow, but it's got that little hint of orange to it, so it looks a lot more fiery than the others. Now I'm going to use a little bit more Evil Sun's Scarlet. I'm going to use this just to touch up the red, add a little bit of bright fire to it. Not going to use too much of this really, just on some of the more raised and dark areas. It's a little bit more attention spent on this fire than I did with maybe the Master of Possession, and that's only because this flame didn't work quite as well because it's a lot more smooth. I'm pretty sure it is meant to be smoke, but I like the idea of it still being blazing, so there you go. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Nuln Oil just to darken up the ends of these sections and make it look like there is some smoke forming there. Now when you're doing this, you'll find that the Nuln Oil won't always give it that immediate darkness. You'll have to give it a couple of coats. When it dries, add a little bit more. When it dries, add a little bit more. That just gives it that little bit of smoke where the flames turning black and you get the smoke coming off it. It's quite a nice effect once it's dried, if it's done properly. Now we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Wazdakka Red. We're going to start going over the armour. Now other than the sections of armour which are completely underneath the miniature, so like the underside of the legs, the underside of the arms, the underside of the shoulder pads, we're just going to completely go over the armour with this, just to recolour it in, and you're going to make sure that you leave the Druchii Violet in all the recesses. The reason we're not doing under the arms or under the legs is because there's not going to be much light being caught there, so it will be naturally shaded by the light, so we're going to leave the Druchii Violet there, just so it's got that little bit of extra darkness on the underside. Next up we're going to be using Citadel Khorne Red. Now this is another base colour, it's not that much of a different colour to the Wordbearer's Red. It's only slightly different. Once it dries you can just about see it. It's easier to see with the naked eye than it is on the camera. The light seems to wash it out a little bit on the video, I think. What seems to be when I was recording it anyway. But you can see the difference on there. But you want to be doing the areas which will be catching the light here and giving them a nice highlight of Khorne Red. What we're going to do now is, once we've got all the Khorne Red applied, see it doesn't stand out too much, you can see it, like the top of the backpack there, the top, say 50% of those exhausts or the globes on the sides where the exhausts are on marine backpacks, that has got the Khorne Red on. But now we're just going to use a little bit of Citadel Wazdakka Red to highlight all these areas. I know it's a layer, then a base, then another layer that we're using on this for the red, but I'm working entirely on the colours rather than the specific layering system that Games Workshop set out. Because I wanted to keep the red quite subdued and then use the Wazdakka Red as a nice highlight to those areas and to the edges to make it stand out. With that done, we're moving on to Citadel Rakarth Flesh. Now I'm going to use this to do the insides of the cloak, get them back up to the Rakarth Flesh colour, making sure that you're leaving the sepia on display in the recesses. So you want a little bit with the recess down the front there with the sepia still showing. And then when we start adding the layers of highlight, that'll give it a nice little transition from the sepia up to the lightest highlight. When we come back, we'll have all of the Rakarth Flesh finished. Now we've added a little bit of white to the Rakarth Flesh, I'm going to start highlighting the inside of the cape there. The idea here is you want to be trying to get these highlights on the tops of the ridges so that you'll have the sepia, then the Rakarth flesh, then this layer. There's one final highlight. We're going to add a little bit more white to that previous mix. I'm going to start highlighting underneath each of the buttonholes and the very edges and the very tops of the previous highlight. Now we're just going to use pure white. I'm going to start working on the fleur-de-lis, the eagle on the shoulder, and also the hair. Now you can see there that even though the Vallejo pale grey wash is really light coloured, that you can see the difference when you're putting the white on there. So what I'm trying to do is do lines of the hair from the centre of the hairline all the way down to the bottom where possible, so that you have that vertical shades and vertical white lines of where the hair is going. Next up, we're going to start working on the flesh again. So we're going to use Citadel Khorne flesh tone. Using a very fine brush just to do those cheek areas. And a little bit at the side of the eye there. As always, when you're painting these bits, if it's easier to move the model in a certain direction so that you can get a good brush stroke on there, then do so. Now I'm going to use a little bit of white and mix that with the Khorne flesh tone. We're just going to do one little highlight on the cheeks, and a little bit of skin to the sides of the eyes. Next up, we're just going to use some pure white. I'm going to do the actual whites of the eyes now. As always, you want to get a little bit of white on your brush, and you want to be moving the brush away from the point of it and side to side or up and down. If you do manage to get a little bit too much white on, then just recolour that with the previous colour and start again on that. Pretty happy with the whites of the eyes there, so what we're going to use is a little bit of Vallejo black just to put a little pupil dot in the middle of each eye. I want to get this so that she looks like she's looking down the end of the barrel. So the eyes are going to be slightly towards the centre for her right eye, and slightly towards the outside of her head with the left eye. Like so. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Wazdakka Earthshade. And all we're going to do is we're going to start doing a little bit of a tempered metal effect on the barrel of the flamer. So you start using a little bit of Wazdakka Earthshade on the very base of the flamer. I'll link up a way to do the whole thing on a full barrel, which is a previous video. Next we're going to use a little bit of Seraphim Sepia and do that so it almost overlaps the Wazdakka Earthshade. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Cassandora Yellow. I'm going to do that slightly overlapping the Seraphim Sepia. And next up, a little bit of Fugan Orange. I'm going to do that on the next segment here. Now using a little bit of Carroburg Crimson, doing that so it overlaps the Fugan Orange. I'm going to move on to Citadel Druchii Violet, do that overlapping the Carroburg Crimson. You can't quite see it as well as this because it's broken up by the gold sections, but on the video that I'll link, or have previously linked, you'll be able to see how this works out on a smoother surface. Now we're just going to use a little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade to finish that off, and use that on the end. Next up, we're going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Retributor Armour. We're just going to reapply the colour to all of the gold areas. So you want to be adding this to all the top surfaces and all the top edges where the gold will be catching the light. So you can leave a little bit of the Agraxair shade on the undersides, because you don't want them to be too bright or shiny because they wouldn't be catching that much light. When we finish that, we'll come back, move on to the next colour. Next up, we're going to use some Citadel Liberator Gold. We're going to use this to highlight the gold that we've just done. So like you would do with normal highlights, you're going to be adding this to the areas that are catching the light, leaving some of the previous layer on show underneath it. Like so. Next up, we're mixing a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome with the Liberator Gold. This gives it a really nice shine. I'm going to use this to do edge highlights and a few little extreme highlights on all of the gold areas. That is really good when you put it across the edges because it makes the edges really visible, really makes them shine. So you put that across the edges, you can see how much of a difference that makes. Now we're going to use some Vallejo Model Air Chrome. I'm going to use this to redo the rosary beads and highlight all the Model Air Chrome areas that we shaded before. So again, you want to be doing the top edges, making sure that they have a really nice shine to them, so they'd be catching the light more. Like so. Now we're going to use some Vallejo German Grey. We're going to start highlighting the robes. Now with this layer you want to be adding it to all the raised areas, give this quite a good coat, so that you're just leaving the black in the recesses. Got to apologise for the noise at the moment. We've got I think it's Storm Kira, which is hitting the UK at the minute. So it's giving us a bit of extra background noise. Don't know if you can hear it down a microphone or not. But if so, apologies for that. So you can see how I've highlighted the robes there. Next we're going to use a little bit of Mechanicus Standard Grey. We're just going to do some extreme highlights on these sections, like underneath each of the buttonholes and on top of each of the ridges. Also going to be doing the casing for the flamer as well, so going along each of the edges with the Mechanicus Standard Grey, at least each of the edges which will be reflecting a little bit of light anyway. Next up is Citadel Mournfang Brown. I'm going to reapply some of the colour to the pouches and the holster. Like so. Next up, we're going to add a little bit of Rakarth flesh to the Mournfang Brown. We're just going to highlight that on the edges and the corners where it's likely to have been scraped and chafed. This is trying to add a little bit of a scuffed leather effect to the holsters and the pouches. Like so. Now I'm going to add a little bit more Rakarth flesh to that just to lighten it up once more. We're just going to do a few little striations on the chafed areas. Just give it a bit more of a worn and scraped look. Like so. Next up, we're going to use Vallejo Modeler Chrome. I'm going to use this to do all of the buttons on the robes. That's good colour to do these because it is a very, very bright metallic and it really does stand out. Like so. Finally, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Technical Paint, Blood for the Blood God. We're just going to apply this to some of the larger areas of the light red, which is shown through all the crispy black bits. And this is just to give it a really kind of sore and weeping wound look. It should hopefully have that looking nice and grim by the time we've finished it. And there we have the finished Order of the Wounded Heart, Sister of Battle. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media linked below. Thanks very much.